Hi, this is Daniel Vacanti, and you are listening to the Agile Uprising podcast. You should be listening to me because everything I say is excellent.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Agile Uprising podcast. I'm Colleen Johnson, and my co-host today is Andy Cleff.
Hey, Kyle.
Hey, Andy. We are joined today by Daniel Vacanti.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
Welcome. Andy and I were laughing before Daniel joined us. We're both big fans of your work, so we're really excited to have you on the podcast with us today.
So wait, you were laughing because you were talking about my work? Is that what you were just saying?
No, we were giving each other a hard time about being fanboy, fangirl. Daniel brings more than 20 years of focus on lean and agile practices and is the author of the Actionable Agile Metrics for Predictability, which is hands down probably the book I recommend the most in my coaching and training. So I'm excited to talk through some of these topics with you tonight.
I'm very excited to be here. This is long overdue for this conversation. So happy to do it.
Love the book as well, and promote it when every chance I get. It's an easy read, and it's also enriching the next time you go through it. There's lots of layers of understanding.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. I mean, that's when we need to talk. We need to talk about my new book too. So maybe at the appropriate time we can talk about that one as well.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's start from the beginning here. You were really instrumental in founding what we know of now as the Kanban Method for software development. Can you tell us a little bit about how that journey began?
So I've been playing around with Agile methods in one form or another since about the year 2000. The method I used early on was called feature-driven development. I don't know how many people really know about feature-driven development, but that's what really got me started down the Agile path. And it was in 2006 that I got a call to go out to a company called Corbis. Anybody who knows the history of Kanban knows the company Corbis. And I arrived at Corbis in 2007. By the time I got there, they had already, Kanban was pretty well already established as part of their maintenance and enhancements process. And I was brought in to build out a whole new engineering, I shouldn't say a new engineering team, but I guess to augment their existing engineering team and transfer all of the Kanban practices that they had been doing for maintenance work over to project work. So I led the world's first project implementation of Kanban. And so I don't know if we're ever going to get into this, but it's honestly one of the myths that really drives me nuts about Kanban when people come along and they say, well, Kanban is just for maintenance and enhancement work. Well, it's not true. I mean, honestly, I would bet 90%, 95% of my experience in applying Kanban has been all about applying it to project work. So yeah, I led the world's first project implementation of Kanban and have been focusing on that pretty much ever since.
What was the scale of that project in terms of time, heartbeats?
So when I joined Corbis Engineering, I think they had somewhere around 10 or 12 people working on that maintenance team. We came in and we were doing an SAP implementation, and we were talking earlier about drinking. We definitely need some alcohol to talk about SAP implementations. I'm sure you guys have been involved in those, but it was my job to scale that team from about 10 people to, I think at our max we were around 60 or so, the project lasted for 18 months, 2 years or something like that. They threw in, just for good measure, a website redesign on top of the SAP implementation too. So there was all kinds of goodness going on there. Learned a lot about that. But I don't know, I'm sorry, I'm babbling a little bit.
No, that's it. So you scaled from 10 to 60. It was a year and a half, and it was a project, and you did the whole thing Kanban.
Exactly.
And so at that point, how are you using Kanban and some of the forecasting methods that you had come up with?
Yeah, not very well. So
V1 always stinks, doesn't it?
So I'm really glad that you guys are asking these questions, and I'm really happy about this timing, because it's one thing that I've been thinking about. If you guys will allow me to digress for a little bit, it's one thing that I've been thinking about for the past couple of months, is that I think the Kanban method in general has become bloated and overly complicated and trying to do all things for all people. And I'm constantly reminded of my experience on that initial project where we didn't have a lot of the understanding that we do now about certain things. We didn't have a lot of the tooling. We didn't have a lot of this stuff. And I think, it's the good old days thing, right? But I think there's a need to kind of return to that more simplistic approach where we had a very, very kind of bare bones way of thinking about Kanban and flow. And if you guys would like me to, I can go into that a little bit, but it's very, very different. I think I got in trouble a couple months ago. I said in a tweet that the Kanban method had been perverted by some people, and a lot of people took exception to the word perverted. And I don't know, I kind of stand by that statement because I really do believe that the method itself has been perverted, because I think it's a much easier thing than most people think. So I mean, I don't know. What do you guys think? Should I spend a little bit of time talking about that or not? Or?
Let's get you into more trouble. So what have you seen?
Let's.
So where's the perversion come in? Has some of the things that we've seen in other methodologies, the certifications roll in, the do it my way or you're wrong comes in.
Yeah.
So where's the perversion aspects that you saw that you were referring to?
Yeah. So let me let me back up first before I get into too much trouble. I want to say anybody out there who's doing Kanban right now and is using some of the techniques that are being spoken about right now, if whatever you're doing right now is working for you, that's great. If you're struggling with maybe some of the guidance out there, then maybe there's some things in this podcast I'm hoping that can help you out. So. Let's start with the first kind of big landmine. There's something called the Kanban condensed guide that's out there. That's not so condensed. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this. I think it's over 90 pages.
Yeah, it is. It's not small.
Say what you will about Scrum and the Scrum Guide and things like that, but at least they got their message across in, I think, under 15 pages. So the Kanban Condensed Guide is 90 things, and like I said, I think where they get into trouble is they're trying to be all things to all people. I mean, this is. It's a classic thing where your strengths are your weaknesses, right? And the great strength of Kanban is that it can be applied to any context. Well, the problem with that, though, is now you have to be fairly generic and fairly abstract in terms of how you talk about some of these concepts in order to make it applicable to all situations. So I think that's the first thing. I mean, if you read that Kanban guide, the Kanban condensed guide, it essentially reads like, well, everything good that you can think of doing, you should do, and everything bad that you think you should not be doing, you shouldn't do, right? And I don't think it's very helpful in terms of practical application of knowledge. In my humble opinion.
Yeah.
If I can say.
In my early Agile journey, I was drawn to Kanban for the simplicity and the lack of you must do the following type of imposition of frameworks. Estimating was optional. Roles were optional. Yep. As little as possible that gave you a wee bit of predictability was sufficient. And then you just play with it. So I can't see how you'd fill 90 pages with that level of simplicity.
Yeah, I know. So I mean, if I can, I mean, I'm always trying to think about how do I distill Kanban down to its essence, and I think this is still, forgive the pun, but this is still kind of a work in progress. But as far as I'm,
I see what you did there.
As far as I'm concerned, really, the essence of Kanban is, to be successful with Kanban, you essentially need to do really one thing, as far as I'm concerned, one thing, and that is pay attention to the age of items in progress. Now, that's actually a fairly dense statement. If you think about it, we could probably easily spend the rest of the hour unpacking that statement. But really, all you need to do to be successful with Kanban is pay attention to the age of items in progress. Because when I think about those early Corbis days, that's really what we did. And everything else, the visualization, the metrics, the whatever, were really in support of that one concept of, What is the age of items in progress, and how can we eliminate unnecessary delay in order to get these items delivered to our customers?
I really like the simplicity of that. And, I think this ties back to what you were just saying too. I hear that same feedback that Kanban doesn't work for projects. Can you elaborate a little bit on how do you coach teams that want to apply Kanban for project-based work in overcoming that obstacle or that misconception that there's nothing to push against?
Great question, Andy. Not that you haven't been asking good questions, but that's a particularly good question. So if we think about that, what I just said is if you pay attention to the age of items in progress, applying that to a project context means that, I guess even really in maintenance context as well, but just looking at the age of items in progress, if you're coming at it from that perspective, what you really need is an objective measure of what does it mean for something to have been in progress for too long. How do we know if something is old or not, too old or not? How do we know if something is flowing or not? And that's really where the metrics come in. And those early days, and this is a concept that's really not talked about too much, I think, in the regular Kanban world, but there's always, from the very beginning, there's been this concept of, and it's terrible language, you guys will forgive the language, I personally hate it, I try to use different language in my books, but there's something called an SLA, a service level agreement.
Yeah.
That everything that flows through your process, every item that's flowing through your process, is constantly evaluated against this SLA. And that's where the commitment, the small c commitment comes in, is it's the team's responsibility to get these items to flow through the process within that agreed SLA. And if they're not able to, they need to take action. Or as soon as they know that they're not, that this thing looks different, they need to take action. And that SLA is relevant whether you're talking about projects or maintenance work or whatever, because in a project world, you've got a whole backlog of items, of things that you want to get done. Kanban is not just, well, let's pull stuff in and it takes as long as it takes. That's exactly not the case. That is completely opposite of the case. Kanban gives you a very specific set of strategies that enables you to get through that backlog of items as efficiently, effectively, and predictably as possible. So like I said, whether you're talking about a project context or a maintenance context, these strategies will work.
What do you like instead of SLA?
Service level expectation. Service level agreement sounds too much like a contract with penalties and things like that. That's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about there is an expected level of service for the items that are flowing through our process. So yeah, SLE I think is a little bit better language. And I don't know if you guys know Yuval Yared. I have to give him a shout out. He's the one. He doesn't remember this, but he's the one who actually gave me that language. If you go and ask Yuval, he'll say, "No, I never said that," but he did. So Yuval, I'm calling you out on national television here. So it is actually Yuval's language.
You touch on flow maybe tangentially as the age of items in progress. And I think that's such a powerful piece of this methodology. Is the idea is you start something and you keep it moving until it's done. And the age of the item in progress highlights when you have some drag in your system. And the WIP limits force you not to abandon something that you've started, but you get it done.
Yeah, exactly.
That's an elegant as simplicity, but hugely powerful.
Yeah, so you're starting to unpack that statement, which is great. So like I said, if you say that the Kanban is really all about paying attention to the age of items in progress, what you really have to think about, okay, well, what is age? You have to start thinking about, well, obviously this means that there is a clearly defined point at which something has started and a clearly defined point at which something has completed, right? And anything that's past that started date is accruing age, and everything that's past that completed date is not. And so once you get to that concept, now it's all about, well, what are some of the things that contribute to age? What makes items age more than maybe other items? And you hit on it, Andy, where you're talking about, well, too much work in progress is the number one culprit in terms of things taking too long to get done, is you're working on too many other things at the same time. So now we can start introducing things like work in progress limits. Once we have work in progress limits, we might want to have some other indications of why is stuff taking too long. And that's really where the power of the visualization comes in. The Kanban board itself, we can see work piling up in certain areas or being starved in certain areas, and that'll give us an idea of why work is aging, right? So, I mean, like I said, as you start unpacking that statement, I think the rest of Kanban kind of, again, forgive the pun, kind of flows from that.
I was scanning again today some sections of your book, looking at Little's Law, and I think I was looking at maybe some Wikipedia articles on Little's Law. It never occurred to me how, maybe fractal's the right word or the wrong word, how fractal it is. You take any process and you look at Little's Law, and then you can look at subcomponents or subprocesses and look at Little's Law. How far do you break it down when you're looking at the flow of work on a Kanban board?
Well, so typically, we're talking about the items in progress. Each item in progress should represent an individual unit of customer value. However you're defining that value, it's a user story. It could be at the user story level. It could be at the epic level. It could be at some other level. But it's whatever that smallest indivisible unit of customer value that, when it is actually delivered to the customer, either provides direct value or allows for the customer to provide feedback in terms of, are we directionally correct? That's usually the most granular. I mean, I don't think if the question is, maybe do you go down to, like, say, the task level or something like that?
Yeah.
I mean, there's no reason why you couldn't visualize tasks on your board, but from a flow perspective, I think flow is really all about the movement of customer value through your process. So that's really where you're going to want to focus on. So if that, but to your point, you can go, up the stack as well. So you don't have to necessarily look at stories. You can look at features or epics or, projects or, whatever. Now we're getting into like portfolio Kanban type things.
Dan, one of the things I have the hardest time working through when I'm coaching or training teams that are new to Kanban is talking about why it's okay to use averages in these equations. Can you help explain for all of us why this works itself out?
Little's Law specifically?
Yeah, Little's Law, and then in forecasting as well.
So you said why averages are okay? Is that what you said?
Well, yeah, and I want to follow that up with talking about the size of the work items, because I think that starts to go hand in hand. And it's one of the places I find myself getting stuck in coaching and training is that people can't understand how can you have one system where there's tasks and maybe stories and help desk tickets and different sized items moving through the same system, counting against the same WIP when you're using things like cycle time to forecast.
Honestly, those are probably three questions in one. So let me start with the first statement.
We'll let you pick which one you want to answer first.
Is it okay to use averages, especially when it comes to forecasting? Actually, the answer to that is no. But I want to come back to that. I want to come back to that because I think maybe potentially the more important thing that you're asking is how can we have this? How can a process handle disparately sized items, whatever that means, and still achieve a level of predictability, that we're looking for? How can we have some items that take 1 or 2 days and some items that take 13 or 14 days or even longer? And how can a system that has that much variability really be predictable? And I actually have a talk on this that I give. It's called. We talked about editing later. This might be something you edit out later. I don't know. The talk that I do is called "Why Size Doesn't Matter."
So basically, if we Google that one, Dan, we wouldn't be careful what we put in the show notes.
Well, my name will be at the top of the list, of course. I get surprisingly a lot of guys that show up to those talks, but the point is, a lot of people do get. I think, Colleen, to your point, a lot of people do get hung up on this idea that Kanban or Flow or Little's Law or whatever demands that all items that flow through your process be either of exactly the same size, or I think to kind of what you were getting at earlier, Colleen, is that maybe they average out to be all the same size. And that's not necessarily true. And I don't know how deep to go into this. I don't know how much you guys want me to explore that or not. But I don't know if you can maybe just take it as a leap of faith that you don't necessarily need all of your items to be of exactly the same size or even average out to be the same size. What you really do care about is that over time, the way that you're breaking your stories down or the way that you're breaking your work down does not change dramatically over time. I mean, if you have some stories going through your process that take like half a day and some stories that are going through your process that take 2 years, well, obviously you've got a problem there. But my guess is there's a bigger problem than story breakdown or item breakdown.
All right, so just trust it. Trust Little's law. It will work.
I mean, yeah. I mean, yeah. Do you want? I mean, I don't know how much you want me to? Yeah, how much you want me to spend to spend on
Let's
that? 'Cause
unpack it. So Little's law. You've got in your book half a dozen different variations. All the equations, three sides of the same coin.
yeah,
Sooner or later, what are some of the common mistakes? So let's assume we trust it, and we're going to use it as a law. What are some common mistakes that tell people to be aware of when attempting to use it to help guide them towards a more predictable and stable system?
yeah. So first of all, for the uninitiated, for people who haven't heard of Little's law or maybe haven't seen it or whatever, there are essentially three basic metrics of flow that I coach teams to pay attention to when they're starting with this stuff. One of those things is work in progress, and work in progress is defined as anything that has started but has not finished. One thing is called cycle time. I'm going to use the word cycle time. You can use lead time or flow time or whatever you want, but I use the word cycle time. Cycle time is the measure of total elapsed time between when an item starts and when an item finishes. And the third metric is throughput. And throughput is a measure is the count of the total number of items that are finishing per unit of time. So we got 2 items done per day, 5 items done per week, 30 items done per month. Those are all measures of throughput. Well, Little's law is an equation that says under certain circumstances, under certain assumptions, those three metrics, those three basic metrics of flow are related by a very, very specific equation. And that equation says that average cycle time for the items that are flowing through your process, average cycle time equals average work in progress divided by average throughput. Now, the biggest misconception of Little's law, as far as I am concerned, is a lot of people think that Little's law is for forecasting. Oh, look. So if I know work in progress and I know throughput, then I can figure out average cycle time. Or if I know any two of those three things, then I can figure out the third one, and I can forecast in the future when my project will be done and when a given item will be done or anything like that. I think the biggest myth around Little's law is that you can use it for forecasting. And if you go and read Little, he's very, very, very specific about this. And Little says this law is not for forecasting. It's for looking backward over time over items that have finished to get a better understanding of how our process has performed in the past. And it will give us an insight in terms of what changes we can make in order to make the process perform better in the future. Now, we can't necessarily use Little's law to predict how those changes are going to affect the future, but it's going to give us some insight in terms of looking. So my first kind of biggest myth with Little's law is you can't really use it for forecasting. And this to me, kind of the second biggest thing that I go after is forget about the quantitative side of Little's law. Because people see an equation, they immediately want to start plugging numbers into it. And my big thing is forget about that quantitative stuff. To me, Little's law is all about understanding the qualitative relationship between these three metrics. Because what it's saying is, again, under certain circumstances, all other things being equal, it's a mathematical proof that the more things that you work on any given time, the longer each of those things are going to take. I mean, by definition, it's mathematical fact that that's going to happen. You work on more stuff, they're going to take longer on average, right? Again, under certain circumstances. And to me, that's the power of Little's law, is understanding that relationship, that if you try to increase throughput, but your work in progress increases faster than your throughput does, you're actually making things worse. Things are actually going to take longer than shorter. So I've done a lot of hand waving there. I hope that's okay.
But isn't there an element of forecasting though in that? There's beginning to be a kernel of, if you increase this without decreasing that, then the future is going to look like this.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. From a qualitative perspective, we can say the future is going to look like this. What we can't do is say that, well, if I increase work in progress from 3 to 4, and my throughput increases from 6 items per day to 7 items per day, then my cycle time is going to look like this. That's what you can't do with Little's law. But qualitatively, you can say, yeah, you know what? I can use work in progress as a lever to pull. If my cycle time doesn't look the way that I like it to, I can use work in progress as a lever to pull to maybe affect what that is. Now, if you want to know what that cycle time is going to look at, you have to get into different analytics And that's where, shameless plug, that's where my book comes in terms of the different analytics that you really need to look at in terms of making forecasts around individual items getting done as well as multiple items getting done.
Got it.
One of the things I love in your book is how little data you need to be able to get started. What do you recommend for teams that are new in kind of that first step in capturing and leveraging their data for predictability?
Yeah, so the first thing, if we get back to that whole SLA thing or SLE thing, if you absolutely have no data, and honestly, most teams that I work with, they usually have data somewhere. It's just a matter of finding it and getting it, right? So, I mean, usually there's data somewhere. But if this truly is a brand new team that has no data whatsoever, from a service level expectation perspective, my preferred method is to just put a stake in the ground and just say, you know what, that we think our our service level expectation should be this, and then really just start working stuff through the process and start getting that data as quickly as possible. Because as you mentioned, you know, after several items, you'll have a pretty good idea of whether you're on the mark of that service level expectation or not. And then it really just becomes a matter of adjusting that service level expectation up or down based on the data that you're getting off of your process. And then it really becomes the point of the retrospectives to talk about, okay, yeah, this service level expectation isn't quite where we want it to be. What are some things that we can do to make our process perform better, quote unquote, better?
Yeah, I love that part of Kanban systems. I think it really hits to the heart of the concept of self-managing teams in Agile. And kind of going back to what you were saying with Little's Law, you know, that's the lever that your team has to pull to affect performance. And I think understanding that part of Little's Law can really help the team. You know, you always get that question, why should we follow WIP limits? Or we always break our WIP limits. What should we do about it? I always tell them, I'm not going to make you do anything about it. I want you to understand what it's doing to your output.
I mean, it's what Little's Law is essentially telling us, and you guys are probably familiar with this. I mean, it's one of my favorite exercises to do in my Kanban trainings. It's a penny flow game, you know, where we hand teams pennies out to flip and to pass around and to flip. And the basic premise of this game is that, you know, if you have, because each team is handed 20 pennies, and the basic premise of the game is if you have 20 pennies to get flipped and get through your process, the absolute worst strategy by far, is to start all 20 of those things all at the same time. It's the worst by far. The much better strategy is to understand what is the true capacity of your process in terms of starting pennies, and only do that. You know, in a lot of cases, it's really starting one penny at a time. It doesn't necessarily have to be, but it can be. And you know, a lot of people are thrown by that because we're taught growing up. We're taught a couple of really dangerous, I think, lessons. One is that the sooner you start on something, the sooner you'll finish it, which is one of the biggest fallacies out there, right? Usually, the sooner you start something, the longer it's going to take. That's Little's Law, right? And then the second thing is that the more you work on, the more you'll get done, right? That's kind of the same thing, but that's equally dangerous. So dispelling those two myths is at the heart of why Kanban exists.
Yeah, we'll get some links to that game and a few videos on why size doesn't matter in the show notes. So some of this leads me down the path of why an expedite swim lane in your Kanban board is such an evil thing. And I still have a hard time explaining to many of our stakeholders why pulling something in, quote, fast track just this one thing, screws the whole system up. Can you help us unpack that a little bit? Give me a little more ammo.
Yeah, I'll try my best. Again, if we're talking about maximizing predictability, and usually when teams introduce an expedite lane, that's one of the reasons why that's one of the things that they're trying to do is they're trying to maximize predictability. They're trying to say, hey, these things are so important that we want to be able to pull them in whenever we want to, and we want these things to take priority over everything else and get them through the process as fast as possible. Well, the problem with that is whenever you have an expedite lane and you have an everything else that's on your board, typically speaking, if you have policies around, well, we can pull these items in and they can violate work in progress limits, and because we can violate work in progress limits, We can steal resources from other stuff that's going on and have it go work on that. Well, what happens is yeah, the stuff that's going through that expedite lane goes through very, very quickly. But the question you have to ask yourself is, now all the effort and all the resources that we're putting on that one item or those couple of items in the expedite lane, what's happening to all the other work that we've already started? Right? And the answer to that is, well, that stuff is just sitting there and it's aging. And if we get back to the original statement I said to start the podcast, is it's really all about paying attention to the age of items in progress. What happens is whenever you have an expedite lane, you have some stuff that moves through the process very, very predictably, very, very fast, very predictably. But you have a whole bunch of other stuff that just kind of sits there and takes forever to get done. And that stuff, the more expedites you have, the stuff that's not being worked on just sits there and ages and ages and ages and ages to the point where we have no predictability on that stuff. So usually a much better strategy, rather than having an expedite lane, a much better strategy is to tweak your process to get it such that all items are flowing through your process as quickly as possible. You've optimized your process for flow so that all items are flowing through as quickly as possible. You couldn't expedite anything even if you wanted to. And then at that case, there's a guy I work with right now. His name is Steve Reed at Ultimate Software. He's a big proponent of this at Ultimate Software. His idea is whenever an item comes up that is truly an expedite, because I've tweaked my process and because I've got it as predictable as I can, when these so-called expedites come up, he says, I know with a reasonable confidence that there's something in my process that is going to probably finish soon, like within the next couple hours, or certainly today. So a much better strategy is, instead of pulling in that expedite right away and putting people on that, let's finish something that we already have started, because I have the predictability to know that something's going to finish. Let's get that thing finished, and then when those people free up, we can put those on this new thing and pull it into the process and work it through the same way. Does that make sense?
It does. You put it at the top of the stack and you pull it next, rather than introduce its own swim lane.
Yeah. So, because really what happens is whenever you introduce an expedite lane, what really happens is your expedite lane becomes very, very predictable, and all of your other stuff becomes really, really unpredictable. Well, once your product owner or your business owners or whatever people see that, their natural inclination is then to say, oh, well, I know that if I give them this expedite, they get it done in 3 days. But if I give them something that's not an expedite, it takes them 3 months. Well, guess what? Everything's an expedite at that point.
Exactly. That's the boat many of us are in.
I don't know. I hope that helps. That's another shameless plug. I think it's chapter 13 of the Actionable Agile Metrics book that gets into that. There's a whole bunch of models and simulations that I run through that kind of prove why, from a predictability perspective, expedite lanes are dangerous, very dangerous.
I think for me, the simplicity of look at the age of all the other things and watch them get older and gray and decrepit, and then tell me that they're no longer important. I'll just kill them. We won't do them. Yeah. And we'll just do the expedite things. And suddenly, we'll be back to a standard level of expectation.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
Do you have a favorite method for highlighting aging work on a board or in a system?
Yeah, I do. So this is another shameless plug. So there's as part of the book, or even I guess before we launched the book, my company Actionable Agile has a tool called Actionable Agile Analytics, and if you guys go to actionableagile.com, you can see the tool. But as part of that tool, we have something that's called a work in progress aging chart. And the story of how this chart came about is kind of interesting, maybe not relevant for here, but it's kind of interesting. But it turns out that this work in progress aging chart, for the people who use Actionable Agile Analytics, that aging chart is by far and away the most used chart in all of analytics, as it should be. People are looking at it every day during their stand-ups, and it becomes between the board and this aging chart, those become the kind of the two central focusing factors of your daily that people pay attention to.
What triggers the aging clock? The arrivals?
Yeah, exactly. So that's fundamental. Yeah, now we're getting to foundational stuff, right? So fundamental to all of this stuff working, any of this stuff working, is, as I mentioned before, when you're setting up your process or when you're operating your process, you have to have a clearly defined point at which the team agrees work has started. Whatever that point is on your process, it could be a ready column, it could be the first work in progress limited column, whatever it is, whatever that you have to have a clearly defined point at which we consider work to have started. And any items that cross that line, that's when the aging clock starts, and that's when the SLA kicks in, and that's when all of this stuff happens. And likewise, you have to have a clearly defined point at which stuff is done, because once stuff crosses that done line, obviously we stop the aging clock. And once an item flows from started to done, that total measure of elapsed time between those 2 points now becomes cycle time. When it's in progress, it's aging. When it finishes, it's cycle time. Like I said, understanding that, just having that clearly defined start point, clearly defined end point, that's the fundamental thing that you have to do. If you don't have that, that's where you need to start. And then once you have that, everything else comes from those definitions.
Do we not care about age of stuff in the backlog that the team hasn't totally accepted? So somebody says, this is a good idea, we should do this. Maybe there's preliminary design work or business case done, but it's sitting there in the stakeholder's mind, aging in the backlog.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you might have, so when I was talking about the start point and end point, you might have several of those defined. So you might have, hey, what is our cycle time through development? Okay, what is the cycle time from when the customer requests something to when we're done coding it? Or what is the cycle time between when a customer requests something and when it's actually into production, right? You might have several different cycle times that you're paying attention to. But that's the whole thing, is as you change that definition of when something started and when something finishes, you're going to get a whole different set of data and a whole different set of information that you're going to want to look at that is derivative from that data. So you may very well care. Maybe in our context, we care about when a customer requests something and it goes into the backlog. Well, if that's what you care about, then measure it. Absolutely. But now our started point is when the item goes into the backlog. Do you see what I'm saying?
That clarifies a lot for me. So different cycle times, because it's a different process.
Yep. But and to your point earlier, Andy, Little's law will still apply between those 2 points,
right.
However you define those 2 points. And whatever analytics tool that you use should have a really, really good flexibility around how to define that start and end point.
Dan, you talked a little bit about with the service level agreement, the concept of changing that over time and using retrospectives to look at the data and make decisions as a team. It's one of the things I feel like a lot of teams will set their WIP limits and it's like the law, never change them.
Yeah.
What's your approach around, evolving Kanban systems and how frequently you should make small changes to the system to see how you can improve your throughput or cycle time?
Yeah, so a couple things, and this is maybe where I differ from maybe kind of more the prevailing quote unquote Kanban wisdom out there. But I've had many conversations with our good friend Frank Vega. I think you guys both know Frank about this. When initially setting work in progress limits, I'm actually a big fan of not necessarily doing Kanban style work in progress limits. And what I mean by that is having work in progress limits set on every single column, but rather maybe starting kind of, a little bit easier and having a global work in progress limit, saying that we as a team only want to work on X number of things at a time. Wherever they are, we only want to say, hey, to have 10 things on our board, and just start there. To me, that's a great place to start. Because now the conversations around how is that work in progress limit affecting us and should we change it are a lot easier. When you get a little bit more sophisticated, you might say things like, well, it looks like we have a lot of work piling up between development and test. We might have a dev done column, and it looks like there's a lot of work piling up right there in dev done. Well, at that case, maybe it's reasonable to say, okay, we're going to set an explicit work in progress limit on that column. To say, we only want to have 5 things in there, five things queuing up ready for test, and maybe over time ratchet that down, say from 5 to 3 or 3 to 2. But that's really my preferred method for introducing these work in progress limits. Don't necessarily feel like you have to get every single column limited and get that number exactly right. to me, and I can't believe we're 50 minutes into the podcast and I haven't even said this. To me, Kanban is really all about getting you to ask the right questions sooner. That's really all it's about. And a work in progress limit is an aid to that. Whenever you violate that work in progress limit, it's not that you should never violate your work in progress limit. It's more like when you do violate the work in progress limit, that should prompt a conversation. Why did we do it? What happened here? And what do we need to do to make sure or to help ensure that doesn't happen again?
Or the limit's wrong.
Absolutely, yes.
So you mentioned at the beginning of the show you got a new book in the works. Tell us more about that, Dan.
Yeah, so the new book is called, appropriately, When Will It Be Done? So the Actionable Agile Metrics for Predictability book was really more about defining the metrics and analytics, understanding the specific metrics and analytics around predictability. The When Will It Be Done book kind of builds on the metrics book's work and goes into much more detail around how to use those metrics and those analytics to get much more accurate forecasts. I guess really two things: much more accurate forecasts, as well as much better, much sooner information in terms of how to improve your overall process.
How far along is the book?
It's pretty much done. So if you go to LeanPub, it's out on LeanPub right now. The meat of the book is done. I still have a couple of case studies that I'm polishing that I will add in the coming weeks. And then once all that is done, I'll try and get a version out on Amazon as soon as possible right after that. But the majority of the book, probably 90% of the book is done and is available for purchase out on leanpub.com.
Great. We'll grab the URL, put it in the show notes.
Yeah, thank you.
Is this a book that you think would reach managers and leadership of engineering teams? Because I feel like that's one of the groups that can be the hardest to convince or the hardest to sell with some of these approaches.
I hope so. I hope so. But the problem is, as with all of this, it's such a fundamental mindset shift in terms of thinking about these problems. So like the When Will It Be Done book goes into a lot of detail around probabilistic thinking. And I think a lot of people are scared off by probabilistic thinking. To be honest, I'm kind of scared by probabilistic thinking. I'm not even sure I know what probabilistic thinking is. But it's this idea of the future is uncertain, and whenever there's uncertainty in the equation, you have to take more of a probabilistic approach rather than a deterministic one. And it really becomes about managing risk around how much confidence can we, or how much risk can we live with in terms of projecting a completion date or things like that. So for sure, I think it is management and the executives that need to understand this stuff. And I think, to be honest with you, they're used to managing risk from a probabilistic perspective, whether they know it or not. They're used to doing it. That's pretty much their job.
Yeah. Dan, I also wanted to talk a little bit about Lean Agile US. So you're the founder of this conference, right? That's now in its third year. Is that correct, in Fort Lauderdale?
Second year. I guess I'm more of a co-founder. Ultimate Software that I mentioned earlier. Ultimate Software has really taken the lead in terms of putting that conference on the map. It's really kind of more their brainchild. But I've been fortunate enough to be involved with them. With the conference from the beginning. So I'm a co-organizer. It is in our second year. You guys still have time to register. The conference itself is February 26th and 27th in Fort Lauderdale. So those of you who are suffering through one of the worst cold spells in recent memory, feel free to get on a plane and come down to Fort Lauderdale. It's going to be sunny and 70 something down here tomorrow or something like that. So I think most of the country is going to be below zero tomorrow, but it's a good excuse to come down and get a little sun and, hey, hopefully learn a little something as well.
Am I allowed to say it's an amazing lineup if I'm part of it?
You are, because you are what makes it amazing. Seriously, yeah, I'm not sure. Any help that we can do to get the word out, but our motivation for doing the conference is so many times the speaker lineup that we have, the Colleens of the world and the Joshua Karyevskis of the world and the whomevers of the world. So many times you can only get access to those people if you go to kind of the bigger conferences around the country. And our goal with Lean Agile US was to make these speakers much more accessible, at local venues and at local conference pricing. So, instead of spending $2,000 to go to some conference, you can come and spend a few $100s and come to our conference and get what I think is probably the best speaker lineup that you'll see all year, as far as I'm concerned. Well, with the exception maybe of Mile High Agile, of course, right?
No, it's a great lineup. I'm flattered to be a part of it. And it really is an impressive group of people that you've pulled together for these 2 days. I think every time I go back to the site, I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that person was on there or this person was on there. So you've done a great job of getting a lot of really good talent there to speak.
For anyone who is interested in coming to South Florida, to the Lean Agile US conference at the end of February, please see the show notes for a special discount code that hopefully makes it a little bit more accessible for you guys to get down here.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Dan.
So we're coming up on time. So we've got that going. You've got your book going. How can people get in touch with you if they want to swap stories, pick your brain, invite you to speak?
So the website is actionableagile.com, actionableagile, all one word, .com. My email address, I'm assuming this will be on the website too, but my email address is daniel@actionableagile.com. You can find me on Twitter too. I'm usually picking a fight or two on Twitter. Actually, maybe not that bad, but happy to connect with anybody who's interested in learning a little bit more about this stuff.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again to our guest, Daniel Vacanti, and to you all, our listening audience. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a review, a rating, or leave comments on iTunes, Stitcher, or your podcast platform of choice. It really helps others find us and find our content. If this is your first time tuning in, definitely consider subscribing to our podcast so you don't miss any of our future guests. If you'd like to join the discussion and share your stories around why size doesn't matter, please join the coalition.agileuprising.com. And finally, support from listeners like you helps us cover our hosting and production costs. So see the show notes for how you can become a patron of the Agile Uprising podcast. Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Dan.
Thanks very much for the invitation to be here, guys. I really, really enjoyed it. And thanks to all the listeners, all of you guys out there who are listening, for the support of this wonderful podcast. Yeah. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you too, Colleen, for hosting. And so until next time, this is the Agile Uprising podcast, signing off.